Flora Luca and Ariane Luca from Albania married in 2010 and had 2 children. Facing economic duress, they began arguing. Mr. Luca made violent threats. After those erupted in violent actions, Mrs. Luca reported him to the police. The court issued an immediate protection order for Mrs. Luca for 12 months. Less than 1 month later, Mr. Luca killed his wife. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Luca? Because the police never received the protection order and were not there to protect her. Because the social services office did not receive the order and did not follow up. Because no one notified the local coordinator against domestic violence. Institutions that should have protected Mrs. Luca failed to coordinate and communicate on her case. They failed to follow legal procedures for domestic violence. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Ensure a better coordination among institutions to protect survivors. Make it compulsory training for police officers to assess risks. Require mandatory training for judges and prosecutors on laws to protect against domestic violence. Establish emergency teams of specialists to evaluate and manage risks. Guarantee obligatory and timely outreach to survivors on case status. The 6 children of Mirela Kushta and Arian Kushta from Albania witnessed their drunk father repeatedly abusing them and their mother. After the children called the police, all family members were immediately escorted to the police station. But Mrs. Kushta and her children refused to report Mr. Kushta for domestic violence or request a protection order. Mr. Kushta was detained for a few hours. 6 months later, he killed his wife. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Kushta? Because the police did not assess the risks, despite evidence of psychological violence and alcohol abuse. Because the police did not continuously monitor the case. Because the case was not reported to the referral mechanism to help survivors get support. Because the survivors of violence under the threat did not report it. Because the police, without a report, could not file a case. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require mandatory training for police on assessing and managing risks. Amend the criminal code to criminalize psychological violence. Establishing emergency teams of field specialists to evaluate and manage risks. Ensure a better coordination and communication among institutions providing protection from violence. Anas became psychologically and physically violent with his wife, Indira, as soon as they married. After a year of insults, blackmail, and constant attempts to control her behavior, Indira initiated a divorce. Anas begged Indira to come back. He promised he would change. Indira became pregnant, but the harassment and violence persisted. Afraid for their child, Indira reported the abuse. For years, Anas used child custody visits to hurt Indira. The stress psychologically harmed their daughter. How did this happen? How did the system fail Indira? Because social workers assigned to the case rarely attended child custody visits. Because nothing was done about repeated violence in front of the child, despite video evidence. Because the Center for Social Work showed bias and prejudice towards Indira. Because civil and criminal procedures took an unreasonably long time. Because the courts prioritized Anas's right to see his daughter over protecting her and Indira. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Ensure timely and coordinated actions by social workers, the police, and the judiciary. Provide gender-sensitive training for social workers to prevent harmful biases. Require mandatory training for judges and prosecutors on laws against domestic violence. Take into account all circumstances in a case, such as repeated violence in front of a child. One afternoon, Alina returned home to find a stack of firewood outside her door. a gift from her former partner. When she lit a fire a few days later, the wood exploded. Her former partner had hidden an M52 hand grenade inside. Alina survived, but with devastating physical and psychological injuries. She was forced to take out a loan to cover her medical costs, since she received no compensation from the perpetrator and didn't qualify for free legal aid despite a below-average salary. The perpetrator was convicted, but since his 8-year sentence was postponed, nearly every day, he drives by the bus station where Alina waits, staring at her from his car. How did this happen? How did the system fail Alina? Because she was never informed that she could file for compensation from the perpetrator. Because lawyers were not knowledgeable about best practices for cases of violence against women. Because protective measures were not taken to stop the perpetrator from harassing Alina. Because the state does not offer integrated services shielding victims from financial hardship. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Develop individual plans for protection and support for every woman survivor. Secure adequate and continuous financing for integrated services for victims at low or no cost. Require mandatory training on responding to violence against women for everyone in the system of protection. Amend laws to make quality, specialized support services and free legal aid available to all women survivors. After 10 years together, Fatime filed to end her extramarital union with Basim. She took their daughter and went to live with her parents. After Basim began constantly threatening her, Fatime requested an emergency protection order. 3 weeks later, Basim killed Fatime in the center of Pristina. He has never been brought to justice, and his parents were given custody of the child. How did this happen? How did the system fail Fatime? Because the court did not issue the protection order within 24 hours as required by law. Because when Fatime died, 3 weeks after she requested the order, it had still not been issued. Because as affirmed by the Kosovo Constitutional Court, judicial institutions violated Fatima's right to life. Because the Center for Social Work did not enforce visitation rights for Fatima's parents to see their granddaughter. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Appoint more judges specialized in criminal proceedings related to domestic violence. Issue emergency protection orders within the time required by law. Take consistent, sufficient disciplinary action against professionals who fail to follow the law on domestic violence. On her wedding night, Emine began bleeding heavily from the violent sexual abuse of her new husband. Instead of bringing her to a hospital, her husband took her to a religious leader who gave her traditional remedies. Amine's condition worsened. 3 days later, she died. Her husband, never charged with rape or domestic violence, was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. How did this happen? How did the system fail Emine? Because the prosecution charged Emine's husband with a violation of family obligations, not sexual and domestic violence. Because the lesser charge only came with a 2-year sentence. Because at the time, Kosovo's criminal code did not include a clear definition of marital rape. Because Emine's husband, acquitted in his first trial, was only found guilty 8 years after her death. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Sanction professionals who mismanage cases of violence against women. Appoint more judges specialized in domestic violence cases. Require mandatory training on gender sensitivity and case management for all professionals involved in preventing and prosecuting domestic violence. The first time Andrei was physically violent towards his wife, Maria, was during her pregnancy. For the rest of their 4-year marriage, he constantly abused her. After she took their child and left, he threatened to hurt her and kidnap the child. Maria reported him to the police multiple times, filed several requests for protection orders, and started divorce proceedings. Despite significant video and text evidence of the abuse, Andrei's visitation rights were never revoked. The stalking and threats continued for years. How did this happen? How did the system fail Maria and her child? Because Maria was referred to mediation during the divorce procedure despite her reports of domestic violence. Because the police only issued a verbal warning after Andrei threatened to kidnap their child. Because the court failed to enforce protection orders when Andrei evaded court summons. Because the law sets extremely low punishments for domestic violence. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Harmonize national policies with the Istanbul Convention and the European Union Directive on Victims. Make it mandatory to work with perpetrators in the law on protection from domestic violence. Prohibit mediation by judges in domestic violence cases. Consistently apply the family law to revoke or limit the child visitation and custody rights of violent parents. Zorica and Petar were married for 22 years and had 4 children. After Petar became violent with his wife and children, Zorica requested a protection order and his removal from their home, yet she never received word from the court on these measures. After Petar was charged with a misdemeanor, he spent only 50 days in jail, and then the violence and harassment continued. When he was convicted a second time, despite a criminal record and history of violence, the judge gave him only 2 months in prison, less than the legal minimum. How did this happen? How did the system fail Zorica and her children? Because the court failed to return a timely decision on the protective measures. Because the prosecution did not acknowledge Petar's criminal history and illegal possession of firearms, although reported by the victim. Because the 2-month prison sentence was below the legal minimum. Because Zorica was not made aware of her rights or services like free legal aid. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Make the rights of survivors central to all measures for all forms of violence against women. Legally distinguish between misdemeanor and criminal liabilities in domestic violence cases. Take into account the perpetrator's history of violence during sentencing and in issuing protection orders. Follow the law in managing cases of domestic violence. For over 5 years, Ivan was physically and psychologically violent with his spouse Anna. Anna reported the violence to the police, and Ivan was issued a misdemeanor fine for violating public order and peace. The police took no other steps to ensure Anna's safety. Ivan continued to be violent with his spouse. Because of her disappointing experience with the police, Anna sought the help of an organization that works with survivors of domestic violence. How did this happen? How did the system fail Anna? Because the police did not follow the mandatory legal procedures for cases of domestic violence. Because the violent incident was treated as a violation of public order rather than domestic violence. Because the law stipulates a fine for officials who fail to properly report domestic violence, but this is rarely enforced. Because the survivor was not informed by the police or the Center for Social Work about the services that were available to her. Because the survivor was only provided with protection with the help of a civil society organization. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Establish and fund safe houses for domestic violence survivors in accordance with international standards. Introduce the confidants or persons of trust to provide survivors with information about their rights and legal procedures. Require mandatory training for professionals on handling cases of violence against women. Sanction professionals who mismanage cases of violence against women. Jovana ended her 5-month relationship with Luka after he became violent with her. For the next 2 years, Luka continued to harass, threaten, and physically and psychologically abuse Jovana. Jovana reported this behavior to the police and Center for Social Work more than 20 times, but neither institution took any steps to prosecute Luka or protect Jovana. Legal action only began after Jovana took the case to a local organization that assists victims of domestic violence who advocated on her behalf. How did this happen? How did the system fail Jovana? Because the police did not file an official report for any of the more than 20 incidents of violence that Jovana reported. Because neither the police nor the Center for Social Work issued any temporary protection measures. Because Jovana was not given any information about her rights, the legal procedures she could initiate, or the services available to her. Because once the charges were filed, the entire procedure lasted 7 months, which is far longer than the deadline set in the law. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require mandatory training for police officers, social workers, and public prosecutors on their legal obligations in managing cases of domestic violence. Ensure that police reports are filed consistently and immediately in accordance with the law. Hold officials accountable who do not follow legal procedures and mismanage cases of domestic violence. During their marriage, Mrs. Nikolic suffered repeated domestic violence at the hands of her spouse. She reported the violence to the Center for Social Work. They said it was a family dispute and conducted mediation. The violence continued. The police intervened 65 times during their marriage, but they usually suggested that Mrs. Nikolic should behave properly. Mrs. Nikolic decided to file for divorce and for custody of their 3 daughters. She also filed for a protection order on grounds of domestic violence. But Mr. Nikolic was only charged with psychological violence, which is rarely punished. 3 years later, the court rejected all criminal charges against Mr. Nikolic. He was granted custody of 2 of their 3 daughters. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Nikolic? Because the Center for Social Work classified the case as a family dispute rather than domestic violence. Because the police failed to identify Mr. Nikolic as the primary aggressor. Because the prosecutor only filed 1 criminal charge of psychological violence against Mr. Nikolic, and none for physical violence. Because the children were never recognized or protected as potential victims of violence. Because the court did not consider parental alienation by Mr. Nikolic as abuse, despite clinical expertise showing otherwise. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require mandatory training on gender sensitivity and working with survivors of violence for all professionals. Recognize psychological violence as a severe and damaging form of domestic violence. Require additional training for police officers to properly understand the psychological aspects of violence when assessing risk. Follow strict procedures when responding to any allegation of domestic violence. Petra was in a relationship with Vladimir, who was often jealous. After Vladimir became violent with her, Petra immediately reported the violence to the police, who undertook a risk assessment and issued a 30-day emergency barring order. Vladimir violated the order and was sentenced to 14 days in jail. A few days after his release, Vladimir stabbed Petra to death at a football stadium. The story became a sensationalized news item. The media portrayed Petra as unfaithful and responsible for her own death. How did this happen? How did the system fail her? Because the police did not revise the risk assessment when the perpetrator left jail. Because the Center for Social Work did not react sooner when Petra reported violence, although Vladimir had a history of violent behavior towards his grandmother. Because institutions blamed the victim for her death because she chose to meet him, despite the responsibility to make her aware of the risks. Because the media sensationalized the perpetrator's claim that she had been unfaithful, blaming her for her own death. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require training for professionals to counter stereotypes and develop necessary skills to deal with domestic violence cases. Sanction professionals who mismanage cases of domestic violence. Develop individual plans for protection and support for every victim. Make it mandatory the risk assessment at different stages of procedures to prevent the violation of urgent protective measures. During their marriage, Mr. Mert physically and psychologically abused Mrs. Yağmur and their children. Mr. Mert even tried to burn her to death. She reported him to the police several times. Mrs. Yağmur left her husband and went to court to file for divorce. She received a protection order against him. 2 months later, Mr. Mert stabbed her to death in front of their children. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Yağmur and her children? Because Turkey has yet to specifically criminalize domestic violence against women, as outlined in the Istanbul Convention. Because Mrs. Yağmur and her children were forced to leave their home, not the alleged perpetrator. Because the Mrs. Yağmur was not told she could receive financial support or safe accommodation. Because perpetrators do not face serious consequences when they violate protection orders. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Align Turkish criminal legislation with the requirements of the Istanbul Convention. Make shelters accessible and available for all survivors of violence, as well as for their children. Appoint gender-sensitive and experienced female staff in law enforcement agencies. Require regular training within police units on legal arrangements regarding violence against women. Sanction professionals who do not enforce the law. Mrs. Dilay, a young woman with disabilities, was raped by her aunt's husband. He threatened to kill her if she told anyone. After he raped her a second time, Mrs. Dilay's sister reported it to the police. 1 year later, he was found not guilty because a hospital report stated he had erectile dysfunction. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Dilay? Because all parties involved in the investigation and prosecution process were slow to act and did not assess all the claims and evidence in detail. Because Mrs. Dilay's school counselor stated that her testimony was unreliable due to her mental disability. Because of the incestuous nature of the crime, officials kept the case quiet, preventing the public from advocating on behalf of Miss Dilay. Because Miss Dilay was discriminated against throughout the case due to her disability. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Adhere to the standards in the Istanbul Convention and national legislation when investigating and prosecuting cases. Ensure effective and proportionate punishment for perpetrators. Establish and maintain rape crisis centers to provide short-term and longer-term services for victims of sexual violence. Establish accessible and available shelters for survivors of violence, especially women from disadvantaged groups. Require training for all professionals to prevent prejudice against women with disabilities and ensure their equal access to protection. Employ specialist staff to provide services to women victims of sexual violence, taking into account the particularly traumatic nature of this crime. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.